Muito boa noite, bem-vindos a esta sessão, que será a última sessão deste ciclo de conferências dedicadas às utopias europeias. Ainda faremos mais uma conferência, que será a conferência final, uma conferência de um dia inteiro, no dia 9 de maio. Espero que tomem já nota da data, 9 de maio, que é o dia da Europa e será também o dia da conferência final, em que procuraremos fazer a síntese das conferências que organizamos até agora. Mas hoje temos um debate sobre a utopia da segurança humana e da paz. E temos um painel muito especializado, porque o professor João Cravinho é não só Ministro da Defesa, mas é um especialista de relações internacionais, eu direi isso depois, e a Mary Calder é uma das grandes especialistas internacionais, se não a grande especialista internacional da segurança humana. Portanto, nós vamos falar da utopia da paz e da segurança humana. A utopia da paz é a utopia fundadora da União Europeia. Nós poderíamos ter começado por aqui, porque quando a União Europeia, o processo de integração europeu no pós-Segunda Guerra Mundial começou, o objetivo era a paz. Era construir um espaço de paz na Europa onde a guerra se tornasse impensável. Era, evidentemente, os europeus a tirarem as lições da Segunda Guerra Mundial e do nacionalismo extremo que tinha levado a duas guerras mundiais na Europa, a primeira e a segunda. Pois bem, essa utopia da paz é um projeto kantiano, inspirado nas ideias do filósofo alemão Immanuel Kant, de que as democracias não fazem a guerra entre si, e se construir uma federação de democracias guiada por princípios cosmopolitas, a guerra se tornará impossível. Essa era a ideia primeira da União Europeia, é a utopia realizada pela União Europeia, porque hoje sabemos que uma guerra entre a França e a Alemanha, é uma guerra impensável. No entanto, nós hoje estamos a discutir esta questão num momento diferente da construção e da integração europeia e do debate europeu, como nós vimos desde o início destas nossas discussões. Temos aqui Mary Calder, que é inglesa, e na Grã-Bretanha discutem o Brexit. Aliás, ela está sempre a ver qual é o número de pessoas que já votaram numa grande movimento para impedir o Brexit. Pois bem, há uma crise das democracias europeias. Ora, se a utopia da paz é construída na ideia de que as democracias não fazem guerra, a questão que eu deixo desde o início aos nossos convidados é se o facto de haver uma crise das democracias europeias não faz perigar a utopia da paz, baseada exatamente no princípio kantiano que as democracias não fazem guerra entre si. Nós vemos hoje surgir por toda a Europa tendências nacionalistas, xenófobas e liberais. Mas há outro problema que se põe à utopia da paz na Europa, e onde a segurança humana possivelmente é a questão essencial, que são os conflitos nas periferias da Europa. Será possível continuar a construir a Europa como a grande Suíça, rodeada pelas guerras, as mais terríveis guerras deste mundo, como a guerra da Síria, com mais de 400 mil mortos, 7 milhões de refugiados, uma tragédia humana sem precedente? Mas também há os grandes desafios das crises humanitárias. E nós hoje temos acompanhado todos, em Portugal, o que se passa em Moçambique, uma terrível crise humanitária. Qual é a responsabilidade da Europa na resolução dos problemas de segurança dos seus vizinhos e nas grandes crises humanitárias que enfrentam países hoje como Moçambique e outros no passado e outros enfrentarão no futuro? A segurança humana, que vai ser o nosso tema e que vamos discuti-la, possivelmente será a grande utopia do século XXI para construir esta ideia da utopia da paz. Porque a segurança humana tem exatamente como objetivo prevenir e proteger os cidadãos em situações de conflito extremo, ou então de crises humanitárias gravíssimas, de proteger os direitos humanos, coloca os direitos humanos no centro da segurança, e isso é o tema do nosso debate, e mais não direi. Eu, como sempre, apresento um trailer de um filme. Tive a tentação de não apresentar um trailer, mas apresentar um vídeo de uma reportagem que vi ontem na Sky News. E digo-vos a reportagem antes de deixar com o trailer do filme. Nessa reportagem, uma equipe da Sky News foi a Moçambique e chegou a uma aldeia onde estavam 2.000 crianças a sofrerem de fome e com perigo de morte pela fome. E a equipe da Sky News entra na aldeia, as crianças vêm em direção à equipe e dizem: vocês trazem-nos pão, vocês trazem-nos comida. E eles vinham só para filmar. Isso mostra, evidentemente, se eu mostrasse isso, mostraria como a segurança humana teria sido essencial uma resposta rápida, internacional, para prevenir antes problemas gravíssimos que enfrenta Moçambique, mas sobretudo hoje, para fazer frente a esta tragédia humanitária sem precedente naquela região da África. Eu deixo-vos com um filme sobre a guerra na Síria, a que eu já referi. O filme chama-se Cries from Syria, é de um realizador norte-americano que se chama-se Eugeni Afenevsky, e é, como todos os grandes partes dos filmes sobre a Síria, feito com vídeos que foram enviados da Síria para o exterior. Vocês vão ver esse vídeo e depois começaremos o nosso debate. Muito obrigado.
Syria is a very ancient and beautiful country. It's called the cradle of civilization. But we have been living under dictatorship for 40 years. But we were so optimistic that the revolution will sooner or later start in Syria. They wrote, "It's your turn, doctor," because Bashar al-Assad was trained as a doctor.
But anyone who talks about him, he will just disappear or he will die.
It was horrible. It started the revolution all over Syria. More than 500,000 people joined the demonstrations.
Our job is to save their life through destroying the terrorists.
We demonstrated holding roses, and he called us terrorists.
This regime, they are supposed to protect us, but they are not protecting us. They are shooting us.
فصرنا انه هاي الحرب فرضت علينا فرض.
أصدقاء مدرسة تدرس الطلاب.
في عالم ماتت من الجوع، في عالم نامت ما فائت، في عالم نامت بدون ما تاكل.
وصل لمرحلة انه خلص شارف على السقوط، يعني ما عاد عنده قدرة يحمي اي منطقة من المناطق. هون اضطر يستعين بميليشيا طائفية عابرة للحدود.
When the Russians got involved, things are getting worse every day.
قالت انه رح تحارب داعش، وهي كذبة كبيرة، يمكن أكبر كذبة بتاريخ البشرية.
We Syrians are the people who are suffering the most from ISIS.
إنه ما ضل حدا بسوريا أو ما طلعت.
وينامون بالشوارع وينامون بالحدائق، ليش؟ راحوا يبحثون عن الأمان، راحوا ليعيشون أطفالهم يعيشون حياة كريمة.
There is a group of people who give us hope, a group who are trying to save lives.
يعني أنا عند اللي شلتها حسبت إنه بنتي.
We are not terrorists. We are people like everyone in this world. And we still have dreams.
جاي وقفوا الحرب كتير، أنا إذا وقفتوه كتير يعني بشكركم.
Vamos então iniciar a nossa discussão. Eu ia dar a primeira palavra ao Sr. Ministro da Defesa, professor João Cravinho. Queria apenas referir que o professor João Cravinho não é só Ministro da Defesa, como já disse há bocado, é um grande especialista de relações internacionais. Por coincidência, para o tema que vamos discutir hoje, a sua tese de doutoramento, feita na Universidade de Oxford, foi sobre Moçambique, Modernizing Mozambique, Frelimo Ideology and Frelimo State, foi em 1995. Eu conheci-o no fim quando ele terminou a tese, e foi nessa altura que eu tive o prazer de colaborar com ele no quadro do Instituto de Estudos Estratégicos Internacionais. E depois acompanhei a sua carreira académica e política e diplomática, porque, como sabem, foi secretário de Estado dos Negócios Estrangeiros e da Cooperação, foi embaixador da União Europeia na Índia e no Brasil, e hoje é Ministro da Defesa. E, portanto, é a pessoa indicada para nos introduzir este tema, e depois passarei a palavra a Mary Calder e introduzirei a Mary Calder. João, muito obrigado por estar aqui.
Muitíssimo obrigado. Muitíssimo obrigado, Álvaro. De facto, é um prazer enorme estar aqui na Fundação Serralves. Doutora Ana Pinho, muito obrigado. É a segunda vez em que participo em debates deste género aqui na Fundação. Foi há cerca de 2 anos, talvez, que cá estive pela última vez, com gratas recordações desse momento. Portanto, um grande agradecimento pelo convite e quero manifestar a minha enorme satisfação. Vou falar em inglês para promover um pouco a interatividade com a Mary Calder. Queria dizer que tenho boas notícias e más notícias, e começando pelas más, diria que tenho aqui um discurso de 18 páginas. A boa notícia é que a letra é muito grande, com espaços largos entre as linhas, portanto espero não ocupar mais do que os 15 minutos que o Álvaro me deu, e se assim fizer, o Álvaro seguramente que me chamará a atenção. Portanto, passo agora para o inglês. To talk about European Peace Utopia, and to talk about European Peace Utopia sitting next to Mary Calder requires that we start by reforming the security or rethinking the security challenges that we face today. So it's a cliche to say, of course, that the challenges we have are new, they're dynamic, they're hybrid, they're multifaceted, etc. It's probably the case that every generation thinks that it is facing new challenges. I think, though, that when Mary Calder and others started to talk about new wars 20 years ago or so, that they were onto something very important. And one of the aspects that I would like to start from tonight is precisely this notion that the new wars of the 90s have actually become newer. There have developments that deeply affect the kind of challenges that we face, and that when we talk about the utopia of peace, we have to be thinking about the kind of challenges that we have to that utopia. So, spoiler alert, I'm going to use some of the concepts that were developed by Mary Calder, or at least some of the ideas that were inspired by her. I think back then, back in the 90s, talking about new wars, probably it was very much inspired by the fact that we had Bosnia and Somalia and Rwanda, and we had situations that the international community, if we can use that expression, was incapable of dealing with, and that we had the type of conflicts that had entirely new characteristics compared to what we had been used to earlier, at least in the 20th century. I think that at that time, Mary Calder was talking about 4 dimensions that we had to look at, or at least perhaps that's in your more recent piece, looking back on new wars, where you say, okay, we have to look at who are the types, who are the actors, who are the people, institutions, forces that are involved in conflict, what are the goals that they are trying to achieve, and in what manner are these goals different from previous types of conflicts, what are the methods that they are employing, and what forms of financing are they using. And if we look at those 4 dimensions of actors, of goals, of the methods that they're using and the forms of financing, and apply this question to any number of situations of conflictuality around the world, we rapidly reveal that we are facing very, very different challenges from the ones that we know about in the history book. So I think that there is an easy vindication of the notion of novelty, But that doesn't solve our problem. It does, though, I think, help us to shine a little bit of light on the kinds of issues that we should be looking at when we think about preserving peace. And this is an uncomfortable light, because these issues force us to look at dynamics that are happening in our own societies. And in particular, the fact that our societies have become digitalized in a manner that, of course, helps to prepare for some 21st century challenges, also has produced a whole new range of vulnerabilities which are currently being explored, sometimes exploited. One concrete example, I'm going to finger point at a country, but the point I want to make is more abstract and much more wide-ranging. But it's an easy and obvious example which I think can be useful at times. Central African Republic is a country that in Portugal we've come to know a little bit about, because we have 200 troops there. And in Central African Republic we find that there are private Russian companies of different sorts, including mercenaries, mining companies, more or less shady mining companies, operating in parallel with Russian official Russian diplomacy, which is working more or less alongside and sometimes diverging from the United Nations operation MINUSCA. So a completely different scenario. I don't know of precedents for this. We have the story of Crimea, which is not necessary to recount. It's well known. And in various other countries, there are also examples of non-official Russian engagements on the ground in bigger ways, in smaller ways. We have obviously Russian origin interference in democratic processes, United States, of course, Brexit process. We have Russian support for anti-establishment parties in Italy, in France, with Marine Le Pen, Matteo Salvini. The point is not about Russia. The point is about the kind of dynamics that we're facing. Today it's Russia because of the obvious nature, but there are other countries involved, and tomorrow who knows what it will be. The point is that we have entirely new dynamics that we need to face when we talk about security, when we talk about our Peace Utopia, and these dynamics lead us to look inside at our own societies. They lead us also to question the distinction that we have in the Portuguese constitution and many constitutions around the world, the distinction between the security and defense, the distinction between internal and external, the distinction that somehow we have, the notion that somehow we have a compact, homogeneous community which can be under threat from some external force, and that the role of defense is to protect from that external force. Today's world is the kind of world where that distinction makes less and less sense, and yet it's still very much present in the organization of our societies. So, obviously we need to be thinking about integrating our cybersecurity, cyber defense. Obviously we need to be able to think as a society, how are we going to respond to threats that come to us as a society? In other words, threats that undermine our way of life, the factors that bring us together as a society. And this is not going to be achieved simply by investment in weapons. That's also necessary for a number of other reasons, but that's not the solution to many of the issues that we face in defending our peace utopia. In fact, even in the domain of weapons, we also have a number of blurrings of lines. We have new kinds of technology, including technology that allows for artificial intelligence to be used in the field of weaponry, which again brings out entirely new dimensions. You can have somebody sitting in their office in the other side of the world and organizing strikes and going home at night and having dinner with their family. So this is a whole brave new world, one in which we are, I think, obliged to rethink many aspects of the way that we traditionally approach security and defense. Because this is about European utopias, I want to talk a little bit about the European Union. I think that there is an understanding in Europe that the defense and security of Europe is the defense and security of each of our countries. There is a sense that we have some common issues that we have to be able to face together, and there is a sense, at least at the level of governments, that only through cooperation and solidarity can Europe have the ambition of having some international relevance in terms of global security and in terms of regional security. This realization, in fact, is driving unprecedented advances in terms of European defense or European defense union. Already, for many years, the European Union is a major global actor in the civilian dimensions of security. Development, humanitarian aid, trade, and so on. These factors, Europe is a giant, and these are critical dimensions for the sustainability of security in Europe. But there is no denying, I think, that there has to be at the moment also the development of a military dimension in order to provide the European Union with the capacity to influence in other parts of the globe. So soft power is not powerful enough, basically, is the notion, I think, that is very strongly entrenched in the last few years in the European Union, and there has been a lot of movement in trying to address this. So this brings us to the question of the relevance of the armed forces in these times in which we live. How can the armed forces be useful for addressing these kind of unconventional challenges? Why do we need to invest in defense? What consequences for the European Union's international identity can we expect from the development of European military capabilities? These are open questions, but I think that they have positive answers in the way that the leadership of the various European countries are moving forward. What I'm not sure is that this movement is rooted in European societies. The military still has a task. It has a fundamental task, and I'm not going to go into the details, but I want to mention one aspect which is perhaps not the first one that comes to mind, which is actually it also has an identitarian task, which is why there is so much allergy when there is talk of a European army, because in terms of our identity, we still need to have reference to our military capacities. I think that's true in many, many European countries. And I don't think this aspect should be underestimated. For us, as Portuguese, our participation in international missions, European, NATO, United Nations, this is part of our work. I think that there is an understanding, not a deep understanding, but a generic understanding that participating in international peace missions around the world is necessary because this is part of our own security, because the security of our country begins very far from our borders. There's a sense, I think, that people have overall that we should be contributing to peace missions because of this. And I think that's very, very positive, and it allows us to participate in 29 missions around the world without any significant opposition. I think we see this as an important contribution that we make, but The important aspect of this, or the necessary consequence of this, is that we have to see results. We have to see that we are contributing to peace and stabilization in other parts of the world in order for this to be sustainable. And I suspect that this is true for countries around the world, that it is extremely difficult over the years to sustain an investment in military missions abroad, especially when they can have human costs for our troops, if there is not a sense that it's producing results. So we need to, in order for the results to be there, we need to be operating in an international environment which allows results to be produced. Sometimes that's the case, and sometimes that's not the case. With the European Union, with its global strategy, which has three central elements: the idea of responding to external conflicts and crises, the idea of building the capabilities of partners in our region, and the idea of protecting the European Union and its citizens, and these three are interconnected. I think that we are making important advances in achieving these goals, but that we are still very much hamstrung, we are still very much impeded by, or there is still a strong sense in our countries that, in fact, it's not the European Union at the end of the day that is going to provide ultimately our security. This, we don't know how things are going to develop. We know that they're developing very fast. We know that relations between NATO and the European Union, although they have moments of tension, they are actually more significant now than they ever were in any previous periods, and I think that's important to underline when people talk about rivalry between European Union and NATO. In our country, in Portugal, we don't see it in this way. We are an Atlantic country, we are a European country. There is no way that we can separate those two identities, and so we need them both to be present in our security outlook. And therefore, when we see the European Union, that sometimes these issues are placed in opposition to each other, this is something that is problematic for us. But it's not a necessary opposition, and I think that there is plenty of space for an accommodation which results in each institution playing to its strengths, each institution operating in contexts where it is most, to which it has a better vocation. In the case of, in the European Union, the vocation, I think, results precisely from the capacity to bring a whole range of tools into the equation which are a wider range than NATO has, and I think this is extremely important as we develop what is called the strategic autonomy. The strategic autonomy of Europe is a phrase that has provoked a lot of discussion and debate. I think the important aspect is to see it not as strategic autonomy from something, but as a strategic autonomy for something. In other words, when we talk about strategic autonomy, there are many people who say strategic autonomy from what? And that must mean it's autonomy from the United States. I think it's much more important to be saying strategic autonomy for what? For doing, for carrying out the kinds of missions and carrying out the sense of responsibility that the European Union has, which is particular to it, and which requires a certain set of tools and which requires a level of autonomy, rather than saying that this is something that has to be done in opposition to NATO, to the United States, and so on. So I think the European Peace Utopia has to function through an understanding of the for, of what strategic autonomy is for. I wanted to also mention, Alvaro spoke in his introduction about the Peace Utopia being in the foundation of Europe. Yes, it's a peace utopia resulting from the history of Europe, from the Second World War, the First World War, and so many other wars. But it's also a particular utopia. It's a utopia that brought together a sense of social solidarity. It was a utopia, is a utopia that was based on a notion of how societies should be, not only, of course, that they should be based in peace and war should be avoided between the neighbors, but one that has at its basis a notion of social solidarity. This aspect has to be a part of European external relations. And in many ways it is. European external relations do have a strong element of social solidarity and human solidarity present in it. That's perhaps seen as a weak point in Europe's projection of power, but I think that it has to be built upon and not rejected and left behind when we talk about the development of European military capacity. It should not be done at the expense of Europe's capacity to develop relations around the world based on what was so central to the foundation of Europe itself. If we do that, then we lose the notion of the European project, and we lose ultimately the notion of the European peace utopia. This is under threat from a sense of a closing down, a Europe that is closing down. There is today in Europe a terrible division between those who have a more open perspective of the continent, and I think they're still the majority, versus a growing group that is saying, no, we must close down. They don't put it exactly in those terms, but in practice it's that. That is a tremendous blow to European capacity to project its power externally, if that is the route that is chosen. It's a notion that is erroneously based on the idea that we must take care of our own and we have been too generous to others. This, I think, is a fundamental error which, if followed, will lead to the weakening of Europe. And we are seeing this already across the Mediterranean. We are seeing this in the manner that some countries are developing their approaches to European external relations, which is why I think that it is fundamental for countries like Portugal, many other countries also, to be very firm at this moment about the need to have an open Europe. As we come up to the date of European elections, this is going to be an issue that is going to be debated, and I think that it is extremely important for our own future, for our security, for our defense, to say it has to be based on an open Europe. So I see Alvaro is looking at his watch. I take that as a sign, and I will stop there. Thank you.
Now I have the pleasure to give the floor to Mary Calder. As you know, because I'm sure all of you have followed Mary Calder's works in the last days, at least, because we have published in the page of Serralves some of her debates and some videos with Mary Calder explaining the concept. But anyway, I want to introduce in 2 words Mary Calder. She's director of the Conflict and Civil Society Research Unity at the London School of Economics. In that center, she directs, I think, is the largest project that you have in the center, a center on exactly on conflict research. It's a program on conflict research. I met Mary Calder when she was working in a report on human security as a concept for the European Union, as doctrine for the European Union, at the demand of Xavier Solana. And she came to Paris to present to the UISS that report, and we have discussed. And I discovered how important was the work of Mary Calder at that moment, and how impact it could have in the European Union if the European Union would follow that concept of human security, putting human rights at the heart of the European security policy. And she has published a number of books on human security, on global security cultures. She comes from China, I think, where she was going to, the book was translated as Global Security Culture, that was translated to Chinese. So there is a global outreach of her activity, and I'm sure we are going all to get a lot from her presentation and debate. But let me just give an information. We have an application. It's called Slido. It's going to appear at a certain moment. If it, where you can put your questions directly to the members of the panel or through this application, Slido. And through that application, I will take the questions and I will ask the people, members of the panel, to answer to them. And also we have a small poll that you are going to answer if you want through that application. But Mary Calder, please, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you so much for inviting me to Porto and allowing me a nice respite from Brexit. It's also wonderful to meet the Minister of Defence and to hear him talk about new wars. That's great. So I thought I would start not with utopia, but I started thinking about the difference between peace and human security. And I think, actually, I'm going to say that peace is actually almost an anachronistic concept. For me, I think peace is very much linked to a traditional concept of war. In the past, we had wars between states, or we had civil wars between rebels and governments. They were very clearly outside and inside. They had beginnings, they had endings, and war was interrupted by peace. And it was quite clear. And so peace was the answer to old war. Whereas I think human security is a concept that emerges out of globalization and is developed in relation to new wars. And I want to start by just explaining the difference, not so much in empirical terms as the Minister of Defence explained, but actually in conceptual terms, the difference between old and new wars. I think old wars, whether they were wars between states or wars between governments and rebels, they were deep-rooted political contests. And each side tried to win, and as Clausewitz told us, they tended to the extreme as each side tried to win. And they tended to end decisively with a victory or a defeat. I think new wars are very different. They're more like almost a social condition, or you might call them a mutual enterprise, in which the various armed groups gain from violence itself rather than from winning or losing. And they gain from violence either because it's a way to propagate an extremist, exclusive ideology. In peacetime, people don't really like these exclusive identity politics or these religious fundamentalists, but in wartime, when there's fear, they do. Or for purely economic reasons. They gain from loot and pillage and smuggling. And these wars, the violence is almost always directed against the civilians rather than the other side. The battles are rather rare. And they tend to persistence rather than extreme. They're very, very difficult to end. If we look at the wars going on around us, the Congo, Afghanistan, Syria, they seem to go on and on and on. Now, I think the problem is that the traditional peace approach simply doesn't work in contemporary conflicts. And the peace approach is to say either one side has to win, so we intervene on one side, or we reach a compromise between the two sides. And the United Nations has has tried to organize talks between the warring parties to reach compromises. And the problem is, these guys aren't really interested in ending the war. But if they do, it's only if they have a privileged position in government. And so what these peace agreements do, and there are literally hundreds now that the international community has signed, is they basically legitimize mafia bandit types. And if they succeed, which is very rare, they entrench their positions and allow them to continue their predatory activities. Maybe the violence is a bit less, but mostly they don't succeed, and mostly the violence continues. Bosnia is the best example. Everyone points to Dayton. Actually, Bosnia, you know, the three exclusive criminal parties were entrenched into politics. If you go to Bosnia today, it's as though the war never ended. It's a dysfunctional society, huge unemployment, and it's only been sustained by an enormous amount of money, more money per person than was the case in Marshall Aid, and by the presence of thousands of troops, which we can't do in every case. The other option, victory, doesn't seem to work either. Military intervention, as in Syria, makes things much worse. You know, people yesterday, I think they celebrated the end of ISIS. What did it involve? It basically involved reducing all of these cities to total rubble, killing very large numbers of people, and ISIS is reappearing in the liberated areas. And in my program, actually, we've done interviews in some of the areas, and they say they would prefer to be under ISIS simply because at least, although they hated ISIS, they felt safe. They didn't lose their homes. So this is really terrible. And if you think about Assad, yes, somehow with Russian and Iranian backing, he's removed the opposition, but he presides over a new war society, that militias all over the country, a criminal economy. It's not really a victory. And if I'm thinking, and now I'm going to shift from here, what it means, what are the risks to our peace in Europe? I think the risks of right-wing populism are not so much the risks of a renewed war between the states of Europe. The risks of right-wing populism is low-level new wars emerging. If you look at the right-wing, the populist regimes, whether you're talking about Trump, Putin, Orban, they love each other, actually. They're not competing against each other. It's against the foreigner. It's against the Muslim. It's against individuals. And I think the risk of these right-wing populists is that we get an increasingly toxic mixture of neither war nor peace, a new war which involves hate crime, organized violence, and human rights violations. And, you know, that's very different from the model implied by Kant, even though I think the key problem is the failure to stick to cosmopolitan values. It's a lack of democracy, but even more, it's a failure to stick to cosmopolitan values. So let me turn, what is human security? Human security is a strategy for addressing new wars rather than old wars. And actually, when I first developed it, funnily enough, I called it cosmopolitan law enforcement. And then I decided it was too intellectual if I wanted it to be adopted. So I shifted to human security, and then I discovered that other people's versions of human security were very different from mine. But I'm not going to go into that whole discussion. Let me just tell you how I understand it, and I think how it is relevant for the European Union, is human security is what we enjoy in a rights-based, law-governed society like Portugal. And in a society where we enjoy human security, we take it for granted that if a disaster happens, there will be emergency services, ambulances, fire, police, who will come to help us. And for me, what human security is that instead of defending ourselves against the external threat of a state, we aim to extend human security outwards. And I think this is what the European Union has to do. Those emergency services it has to build They do include a military dimension. I think that's really important because you have to protect civilians from violence. But I think it's a very different way of using the military, and it very much involves a combination of the military and civilians. It's got to involve health workers, aid workers, police. It's much more like policing because it's really about protection than it is about warfighting. And I think that is the key distinction. I wasn't going to talk about between NATO and the European Union. I think NATO is an old-fashioned war-peace organization based on the assumptions of traditional threats, whereas potentially, I don't say it is already, even though human security got into Mogherini's global strategy and into the section on dealing with conflict, it actually says the European Union has a human security approach. I think it hasn't quite got there, but that is essentially, that's what makes the European security strategy so different from NATO's security strategy. And what I want to say is we haven't talked about utopias at all, but actually what I keep arguing is that it's precisely because the old-fashioned methods don't work. The war-fighting methods just make violence worse, and the peace methods have all the problems I described. That I feel human security has to be not a utopia, but a practical alternative, a way of dealing with Syria, Libya, these kinds of conflicts from which we cannot insulate ourselves. We are already affected. We're affected by refugees, we're affected by organized crime, we're affected by smuggling, so we have to be able to develop some kind of alternative. I won't go on because you can ask me questions, but I thought I would finish by a little Brexit anecdote. So a few weeks ago, I decided to go and meet a Conservative minister I know to try to persuade him that he should resign from Theresa May's government over Brexit. I was very unsuccessful. He turned out to be a big May loyalist. But he said, you know, the thing about May's deal is it's a compromise. This is a civil war. This is what we do in places like Bosnia and Afghanistan. We find a compromise that nobody likes. And then we impose it on them. And this is what May's deal is. And I thought it's always a compromise that satisfies nobody. Neither side likes it. But that's the way we have to do it. And I thought that illustrates the whole problem of the old-fashioned peace approach. And that actually, if we started from a human security approach, we'd realize that the threat to human rights, to citizenship rights that are implied by Brexit are just completely unacceptable. And so I think I want to end by saying that, you know, human security, perhaps it's the new utopia, but it has to be a practical utopia.
Thank you very much. Mary Calder has just destroyed the idea in which is based the European Union, the idea that nationalism is war, and so Europe should integrate to maintain and preserve peace among its states. You say that's no more the case. War among states is no more possible with the European Union or without the European Union. And so this, I think, is a good start for a debate. And of course, at the same time, she has explained to us that human security makes sense because the threats of today are of a different nature, are not interstate wars. I would challenge a little bit that if we, just to start a discussion, in the sense that I have the feeling that nationalism in Europe today, state nationalism, can create enormous conflicts among the states of Europe. If they remain in power, if you have a group of very nationalist states in power, in Poland, in Hungary, in Italy, the tensions among the European states, I don't mean that will be war, we don't know, perhaps not, but the tension among the states will be quite of a great level. It will not be just against the foreigners. It will be against France, as it is today in Italy. We have seen the Prime Minister the Minister of Italy to go to France to support the Gilets jaunes in France against the President of France. So you have these tensions already in Europe. You don't have between Germany and France, but you have among a number of European states. And we are in the start of transformation of these states. If the anti-democratic process, we went in Portugal, we were at the start of the democratization process in 25th of April 74. Now we are in a process of authoritarianization. Now we are going to start re-authorization of these states. What will be the implications of nationalist states in Europe? I am not so sure that I would say this will not mean, at any case, war. But I would like to have João Cravinho and you answer to this first question before we go to the public. João, you want to start? We need to provoke here discussion. We can't agree all the time.
No, I think that...
you cannot agree with on this.
I think that it's looking too far into the future to imagine conflicts between states of the European Union. But I would agree certainly with the premise that nationalist forces, they derive their strength from finding enemies, creating enemies, from exploiting divisions, and that this can coincide occasionally with states. But I think that when you find the leader of Cinco Estrelas, member of the government, in Italy, going to France to support the Gilets jaunes, he is actually he's trying to gain popularity in Italy. And he's doing it at the expense of Macron. That's not a problem for him. But I don't think that his main concern is really to increase the tension between Italy and France. It will happen, but I don't think that's what he's so concerned with. But clearly, the nationalist forces are forces that are divisive in Europe, and they are forces that are seeking to break down the bonds of solidarity at the European level. To say that that will lead us automatically to war, I would not say, but I think we're very, very, very far from that, because I think above all that the institutional and human bonds that exist on the European continent are still extremely powerful, and hopefully will continue to be so. I don't know if, I hope the Mary can disagree.
Well, the only thing I would disagree with is that I absolutely do think that this right-wing populism will produce very dangerous tensions. And I was arguing, I thought rather pessimistically, that I think they could, if we don't stem the tide of right-wing populism, Europe itself will be engulfed in a kind of new war. So it's just that those tensions aren't exactly the same as this kind of organized, militaristic, state-on-state kind of tension that Europe has always experienced in the past. The Gilets jaunes is the perfect example. They're creating alliances across Europe with different social groups. And I find this is one of the most interesting developments now. These authoritarian states aren't anti-Europe. They want an authoritarian Europe. They have a different model of what Europe would be like. And I think their model will, in the end, produce a new war. I don't think they're going to be successful authoritarians the way the Chinese are. They're not quite good enough at it. But that's the sort of thing that I'm concerned about.
Of course, you have Putin and Erdogan, who are two nationalists that are already involved in wars.
That are heading for...
That are involved in wars.
Absolutely.
Both of them. And they are both nationalists.
Exactly.
So you would say that Putin cannot create a war somewhere in Europe? I'm
sure he can, but I just think it will be it will not be France versus Germany or Hungary versus Poland.
But it will be Russia versus some...
I think it'll be Christians versus Muslims or that kind of thing.
No, not the Huntington thing, no.
Not the Huntington, but, you know, it'll be Orban and the Polish government and Savimbi standing up for Christian values against foreigners, and that will be the kind of war. They'll turn it into some kind of ethnic war.
Okay, that's part of the debate. I'm not going on with my own consideration on this. I want to give the floor to the public, to the participants, and you have the possibility of putting your questions using this Slido. You see there, you go in your iPhone or another kind of phone and you'll find the Slido. So, who wants to start this conversation from the floor? Yes, please, over here.
Do I need to listen to...
Yes, I think so.
Which language?
What you want. You are free
Okay,
to speak any language.
Okay, I'll try English then. I was struck by the statement of the Ministry of Defense, who said that people can use artificial intelligence to devise strategies against other states or other targets. I wonder in the other way around. War is such a constant in the human history. You could have built a huge database of how to solve conflicts and use human intelligence and artificial intelligence to find an optimal solution to solve problems. Usually try to use our own experience, but sometimes it fails badly. I wonder if there is such a database. I mean, that would be, I think it would be extremely useful. I mean, there is huge data on war conflicts, and we have all types of them.
Thank you. I'm going to take 3 questions. Second there.
Good evening. Since our armed forces are in the process, in an update process to be in NATO and European Union missions, how hard it is to your ministry to conciliate the capability to answer to a classical type of threat and also do a great job like our Marines are doing, for example, in Mozambique. Thank you.
Thank you. Third question, on the left.
Human security has been actually the primary discourse in the last 20 to 30 years for imperialist interventions. If you go from Iraq to Serbia, Libya, Syria, now Venezuela. So actually, human security as a discourse has actually been used to implement insecurity and war. At the same time, European defense policy actually is actually based also on not only providing security internally, but mainly containing people coming inside of Europe and actually making that the security of other peoples outside of Europe actually gets into danger. The way how there is now a renewed defense cooperation in the European Union actually is based on providing new borders and actually making people feel more insecure. So could we actually not better speak about dystopias of human insecurity than actually human security?
Ok. Uma informação. Como estão a haver muitas intervenções em inglês, há tradução simultânea. Portanto, aqueles que tiverem dificuldade em seguir o inglês, façam favor, procurem os auscultadores para poderem seguir a tradução simultânea. Mas, evidentemente, vamos continuar com o debate. Eu talvez juntasse, porque eu vi aí uma... Ok, quarta questão.
Boa noite. Eu queria colocar 2 questões muito simples. A primeira era como é que se resolveria, como é que resolvemos o problema da segurança ou da paz se houvesse um referendo em cada um dos países da União Europeia exatamente nesse sentido. Quer a população gastar mais dinheiro na segurança? Seria possível não existir um exército comum como nós temos? A segunda questão tem a ver com a questão da economia. No momento em que houver grandes desequilíbrios económicos, uma grande crise internacional, isso não é de facto aquilo que pode motivar uma grande crise a nível de segurança e defesa europeia, nomeadamente. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado. I'm going to give the floor to Mary Calder and João Cravinho, but take in consideration also the questions that have been put through Slido. And the first one, Mary, is in English, is what will be the difference between NATO and the European Army? Is the one who got more votes. And the second is how can we be more able to make international interventions in crisis when we are disinvesting in defense? So this is the two questions. Anyway,
as well as
you take the questions that you would like to take. Don't take all of them. Answer to two or three of them, and as well, we'll see.
Well, I think on NATO and the European Army, I did make a distinction when I was speaking, which is that I think NATO is based, it's the legacy of the Cold War, and it's based on the assumption that the threat to Europe will come from some foreign state, probably Russia, and it's about conventional military defense, whereas I think the European Union, although it may not be, ought to be about human security. So that leads me to the question here, which the claim that human security justified all the interventions of the last few years. I just don't think that's true. Afghanistan and Iraq had nothing to do with human security. They were all about the war on terror. And I think it's really important to make those distinctions, because if we do care about protecting people in other places, we shouldn't treat all interventions as if they were the same. Have there been any human security interventions? Very few, I would say, and interestingly, mostly associated with the European Union. For example, I think the anti-piracy mission in the Gulf is a very good example of a human security mission. I think during Javier Solana's time, it was very short, but the operation in Eastern Congo to stop a massacre was another example. Libya, what came under the rubric of responsibility to protect, and some people equate responsibility to protect with human security. I tend to draw a distinction because I think responsibility to protect focuses on military intervention by great powers, whereas human security is about the right to be protected. And I think there's a huge problem with responsibility to protect, that there's a contradiction between the desire to protect people from human rights and the military means which themselves violate human rights. And both in Kosovo and Libya, I think the goals were very good. In Kosovo, they wanted to, the West wanted to stop the ethnic cleansing of Albanians, but the means they chose, bombing, could not protect the Albanians. It actually speeded it up. And exactly the same problem in Libya. You know, the aim to stop Gaddafi from shooting on his own people was a very good aim. But it's very difficult to do that from the air. So I think the whole point about human security is it focuses on the right to be protected, which means that the means cannot risk the lives of the very people who are to be protected. So I think there is a big difference between human security and the war on terror and responsibility to protect, and it's important to draw those distinctions. On the question, I agree with you about migration. I think I'm very critical of the EU's migration policy, and I think it can threaten the whole EU the whole EU project. I think nowadays it's impossible to control migration. Actually, many more people come into Europe than try to get in through the Mediterranean anyway, by normal immigration means. And we need immigrants. What we have to do is to find a way to manage it that doesn't mean closing our borders and creating this very dangerous nexus of people smugglers, border guards, and so on. So I agree with you about that. And then there was a question. I realized my voice keeps changing. I hope that's not a problem when I move around. There was a question about the costs of defense and, does this threaten the current situation? Well, I'm in many ways an old-fashioned Keynesian, so I think the more we spend, the better it is for the economy. But I do think it matters what we spend on. And I think spending on the military-industrial complex is not a good way of using your money, and it entrenches very old-fashioned interests that are not going to help you solve the problems of Syria or Libya. So it matters how you spend it, and you need to spend it in a different way. I was very struck that I was at the Munich Security Conference when Mike Pence, the Vice President of the United States, came and gave a hectoring speech about how Europe had to increase its spending on defense. And he said very firmly that God wanted it. And I came to the conclusion at the end of the speech that God really wanted us to spend more on American weapons. But
God is American, we know.
Well, God is American.
We know.
But I was very impressed by Angela Merkel's reply, in which she said security is not simply about defense. Security is about a whole series of other things, including well-being, human rights, development aid, and we in Europe want to spend on those things as well.
As you were speaking, there was a poll. We are putting the question of if people would accept military intervention to protect people from crimes against humanity. And I think 72%, you can put again, yes. 74% say yes, force should be used to protect people from crimes against humanity, 26% against.
That's good.
That's interesting. João?
Okay, thank you. I will I will mention a couple of points about NATO and the European Union. I would start with the first question, actually, which was about artificial intelligence, whether it can be used to solve problems. That's the artificial intelligence utopia. Theoretically, maybe, I don't know, I haven't been there. When I see the application of this kind of intelligence to the solution of military problems, I think the one person who tried to do it very, very intensively was Robert McNamara, when he used all sorts of mathematical formula to work out how to win the Vietnam War, and the results we know about. I like to watch a series which I recommend to anybody who has problems sleeping at night, called Black Mirror. Black Mirror is about wonderful technologies that go wrong. And so my answer to your question is, hypothetically, perhaps, but my suspicion is that artificial intelligence will be used for destructive rather than constructive purposes. That it will be used for destructive purposes rather than, it's much easier to do it for the purposes of undermining security than for creating security. But it's with us. We live with it, and so obviously it's useful to try to think of ways that it can be employed in promoting security. database. I'm not sufficiently competent to answer that. But this is part of artificial intelligence, and my suspicions are that it will be used in a negative way rather than positive. And then we also always have the problem, if there is the capacity to develop technology that can solve all of our problems, who will have the right to use that technology, and who will define which are the problems that have to be solved? I'm very skeptical about the use of artificial intelligence in this
I
manner.
meant that if you have the information about words and everyone can access to that, that's extremely useful. I mean, how you use it is something else. But
Orfeo, sorry.
I'm expressing my skepticism.
People, so.
Let me talk a little bit about the NATO and the EU question. I would like to say that firstly, that I think that NATO does very much still have a purpose, and there are, I come very often into contact with defense ministers from Baltic countries, Finland, which is not NATO country, but it's very close to Russia. And you know, there are still purposes there. Furthermore, I think that there are some things that NATO is uniquely capable of doing, which are still required, even in terms of human security, even though that's not the natural vocation of that organization. There was a question from that direction about whether we are capable of having military that can do both things, that can answer classical threats, so classically trained military, ships, planes, tanks, and undertaking humanitarian operations in Mozambique. I think that the answer is yes, but it costs money. We have that in Portugal or many other countries, but we have it in a manner that is insufficient, actually, for all purposes. For the classical purposes and the humanitarian purposes. These days we are conscious of what's happening in Mozambique. We are at the moment in process of negotiating, of spending a lot of money, 800 and something million euros, on buying new transport aircraft. Tremendous amount of money. But the most responses, comments that I have had in social media has been about how long it takes our ancient C-130s to get to Mozambique. So there has to be obviously a discussion about what you need to spend in order to get the results that you need. We at the moment are below what we need. 2% is a number like any other, and I don't think that there is any kind of necessary result that is produced once you get to 2% of spending. But I would say that it would be, we would be very imprudent at the moment if we were running down defense spending, because my sense is that actually we are not capable of doing all the things that we would like, not that we have excess capacity.
Ok. Tudo bem? Posso falar com... Não, mas tem mais uma... Responda mais a uma.
Responda mais uma, tá bem.
Ok, mais uma.
Yeah, I think that the issues that I was trying to hint at when I was talking about strategic autonomy for, rather than strategic autonomy from, and that Mary has developed already partly, and that I also mentioned when I was talking about the natural vocation of the European Union in its external policy. I think that these are factors that make me very ill at ease in terms of dealing with the question of migration. I should point out that European defense has nothing to do with migration. There is no, migration issue is not dealt with in terms of defense. It is dealt with in other spheres, and there are profound questions which we should be asking about the way that we're dealing with migration. I have no doubt whatsoever. I also strongly believe that at the end of the day, our migration issues and our issues of human security in the European continent, but coming from challenges coming from adjacent areas, in particular Africa. They have no military solution. These are issues that have to be dealt with through development promotion. They have to be dealt with through different kinds of political and economic arrangements with the African continent, and the notion that you can solve problems just by undertaking some operations in African countries that are destabilized, and that is going to solve our migration problem. This is something that has nothing to do with what we know about demography and economics and our aging population and our need for immigrants. And one thing that I'm very proud of is that in Portugal nobody questions the need for immigrants. I think that, I don't know if it's so frequent nowadays in Europe, but there is a tiny little party which is so tiny that it's irrelevant, that is worried about that. And I hope that this is something that can be spread into other countries, this notion that we need to be open.
Thank you very much. So we go back to the floor. Yes, please.
Good evening. I think the points that I'm going to speak about have already been slightly addressed, and it concerns the second question that mentioned the natural catastrophes like Mozambique and European Union reaction, and also the migrations, in our case, more important from Africa. We know that demographics cannot be stopped, so both for that reason and due to climate changes and also for insecurity reasons, we are somehow condemned, if we can use the words, to have an inflow of population from south to the north. At this point, I think northern countries have been reactive to this phenomena, which sometimes creates a lot of antibodies, as we have been seeing currently. Do you think that in some foreseen future we can have a more proactive position in terms of European Union, at least, that can avoid these types of conflicts that we have once we cannot stop people coming from south to north because we need them? We are getting older and fewer, and also they need to come to where the resources are. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes, over there on the left. Hey. No se pagou, no?
Okay, we're in peace still. Yes, I would like to ask about the control of resources. We have spoken about the post-war period as a period of peace because the countries that were involved in this mass conflict wanted it. But that came about through the control of resources. The European Union, the European Common Market, the European Economic Community came from the European coal and steel community that controlled the basic strategic resources that could lead to an escalation of war on other sides. So through the control of these resources, peace was able to be maintained. So my question is, will also peace or war in the future be related also to the control of strategic resources? And is it possible for the European Union to have a European defense unit without having first a European foreign policy? Because there seems to be some difficulty sometimes for European countries in the European Union to agree on a common European foreign policy.
Thank you. The last question over there. No, on the... Okay. It was the lady there first, but anyway. So I'll take the floor. You will have the floor after.
Thank you. My question goes to Mary Kondo. So, Cowder, I'm sorry. You talk about a failure about stick to cosmopolitan values. And I would like to know your opinion about what kind of role do you think solidarity plays in this failure inside the European Union? What kind of levels or types of solidarity do you think were not enforced enough until today, or to this time that we are talking about Brexit and all the other stuff?
Thank you. Last question, the person that had the floor before. Yes.
Thank you. Two very short questions. The first one has to do with threats and risks. We spoke a lot about threats today, and we barely spoke about security risks, about the consequences of climate change, about natural catastrophes such as the one in Mozambique, as the issues of development. Are these smaller issues to human security than those caused by security threats? Are they smaller in any way? Are they less relevant? Are they just so far away in the future that we don't really care? And the second one has to do with a more national view of security, in the sense of civil protection, the security forces, the police, the firefighters, and so on. Since that there could be an interesting discussion between the two, since I believe that Mary Calder supports a vision like that, which is to sort of give a higher emphasis to the firefighters, the police, and so on, rather than the military force. But I would think that for a Minister of Defense and for the armed forces, that would be a problem, to move away resources, either personal or financial or so on, from that ministry, from those forces to other budget areas, to other departments. So how would you deal with that regarding those two very different positions? Thank you.
So I'm going to give the floor to both of you. And please see, there are two questions that have been more voted than the others. The first is that if the European army could use nuclear power. And the second is, what is the great threat to European security? Is it terrorism or the rise of the extreme right? And you have the floor. Let's try to end our debate in 15 minutes. And if I could add a question, to go back to my question, my small discussion with Mary about traditional warfare and today human security challenge. It's not true that if you take, for instance, if you are an Iranian, not an European, you would feel that you could have external traditional threat against Iran. They have seen the invasion of Iraq, they've seen the invasion of Afghanistan, so still there is this traditional threat, at least there. And if you take the case of Syria, you have seen the Russian intervening in Syria, involved in fact in a civil war, but there was a clear also external intervention. So still powers are using military force to intervene in other countries. It's not only the internal dimension. There is still, I feel, that dimension. So there is a mix between both.
That's what I think.
Okay, so you have the floor.
Oh gosh, but there are so many questions.
You need to choose, because you have 7 minutes to answer to the 5 minutes to answer to all these questions, and 5 to João.
Oh dear. Well, okay.
But your capacity of synthesis is very well known.
My capacity of synthesis.
Yes.
Because I actually wanted to go back to one of the earlier, well, I'll leave that one
No,
out,
please
about
go.
data. But I did want to go back to defense spending, because I think the problem is not so much the level of spending as the content of spending. I think the big problem, and I see it particularly in my own country, is that military spending is very much stuck in old war scenarios, and in particular military technology. I call it baroque technology, that weapon systems, fighter aircraft, warships, nuclear submarines develop in a linear way and get more and more sophisticated and more expensive and we can afford fewer and fewer of them. And the result is that when countries increase their defense spending, they have to reduce the number of people, the number of soldiers, and spend more on weapons systems. And I think it's that balance that is completely out of kilter, and that, you know, these very expensive, problematic weapon systems that are sometimes used in places like Syria or to threaten Iran, they need to be reduced, but you do need people. So that was one question. I also completely agree with the person who said we need a European foreign policy. We really don't have a European foreign policy, and I think that we will never really have an effective security policy until we have a foreign policy. And that foreign policy, at the moment, I think we have a problem at the political level that we don't really have a real politically led foreign policy. And that foreign policy itself has to be based on human rights rather than on geopolitics. And we've always thought of foreign policy as something about defending the state. But actually, the European Union needs to have a different kind of foreign policy. Solidarity, I'm going to end with that because we haven't got much time. I think this is a huge problem, and that's really why we don't have European politics. We don't have European politics because we don't have enough European solidarity. And we don't have enough European solidarity because politics is national. What is so striking, if you come from Britain, is that the Brexit debate is not about Europe. Alvaro keeps saying to me, but, you know, Europe was so terrible about Greece. Didn't that affect the Brexit debate? No. I think most of the people who voted Brexit don't even know about the Greek crisis. It's entirely an internal British debate. And until we start thinking, I mean, I keep saying, look, you know, don't we want to be don't we want to be inside Europe? Don't we want to struggle against the rise of fascism like we did in World War II? And people aren't thinking about that. They're thinking about domestic issues. But what I do think is that this is beginning to change. I mean, all of you saw in Britain this pro-European march last Saturday. But it's not just in Britain. I think the rise of right-wing populism has made more and more people realize that there are European issues they have to get concerned with. And I think these upcoming European elections will be the first time there have been European elections about what kind of Europe we want, rather than whether we want Europe or not. And I think that's going to be a very significant change and might involve a growing solidarity, not only within Europe, but in Europe and the rest of the world. And that, of course, I haven't said anything about resources and climate change and all of these issues that are hugely important. Somebody else asked about resources. And, you know, we are going to have climate change disasters which the EU has to respond to. I suppose my focus has been very much responding to violence rather than responding. But violence and humanitarian disasters are going to be linked in. But I think the key point is that we are living through a major transition in the world, and it's the end of the period that's based on fossil fuels. And until we can get ourselves together to start thinking in resource-saving terms, I don't think we're going to be able to solve either the economic or security problems of our time. And that's got to be part of this pan-European debate.
Someone putting you directly a question that got a lot of votes, Mary. You once defend military intervention to address human security, Kosovo. Later you moved to a more revisionist view. Where do you stand nowadays?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, Actually, the point was I was in favor of military intervention in Kosovo, but I wasn't in favor of using bombs. And so I always had this contradictory position. And actually it was Kosovo, the war in Kosovo, that made me really think about human security, because I realized that a humanitarian intervention is not the same as a military intervention. I wanted a humanitarian intervention, but I thought bombs were wrong. And that's what led me to this whole journey of thinking about a different kind of intervention force that is not classic military, but nor is it purely civilian. And I suppose if you ask me where I stand now, my worry is that this has turned out to be incredibly difficult to achieve. What you see in nearly all these interventions, that the military are available, they're the people who know how to do things, and they're schooled in war fighting. They think much more in terms of the enemy than they think in terms of protecting people, which is very different from police, or not all police, because they're very repressive police as well. And so, whereas I still continue to say this is a possible way forward, I am more skeptical perhaps about whether it's really practicable, because we haven't seen it on a large scale. We've seen it on a small scale, but we haven't really seen it on a large scale.
Thank you very much, João.
You might need that. I want to firstly apologize because there are many questions that I'm not going to be able to comment on, because I wanted to just comment on two. One that is related to our military expenditure and civil protection and so on, and the other one that is related to the European Union and European foreign policy. On civil protection, the question being whether we had to choose to invest resources either in military or in... my response is absolutely not. I think that more and more we have to be focused on the kind of military equipment that can have a dual use, that can be useful for civil protection needs as well. To give an example, we have at the moment going through Parliament our national military programming law, which is for military equipment expenditure in the next 12 years. 2/3 is continuity. It's building on what already exists, which is normal because the equipment is there and needs to be maintained and so on. 1/3 that is new is nearly all dual use. It's transport planes that people are complaining that we don't have now to go to Mozambique to take assistance. It's the landing platform docks, these polyvalent, navios polyvalent, in order, which will be absolutely fundamental if we have an earthquake in the Azores, for example. Multi-use ships. We've got patrol ships, which are necessary because we have all sorts of needs in our continental shelf. We have helicopters, which are fundamental for search and rescue. So they have military uses, of course, but the question is not either military or civil protection. It's how we use our limited money to be able to contribute to both. On the European Union, I'm very pleased to be able to end with a note of disagreement with Mary, because...
The debate is going to start now.
Because I think that we do have a European foreign policy. We don't have unanimity. We have something that is completely different from our traditional national foreign policies. But I spent the last 7 years, 7 years recently, representing the European Union, first in India and in Brazil. The biggest surprise I had going into that job, one of the aspects of that job was that I had to coordinate the member states locally. I had to chair the meeting once a month and make sure that everybody was saying the same thing. In India, all 28 member states were present. In Brazil, 24 member states were present. That was the easiest part of my job. And that was an enormous surprise. I thought I was going to be spending a lot of my time doing intra-European diplomacy. It's basically, of course, there are moments, there were problems, there were some difficulties, but there is a real sense of a European approach when you are abroad. Once a month, the foreign minister goes to Brussels for the European foreign ministers meeting. All European foreign ministers are there, except for exceptional cases, maybe some reason of force majeure. But he does that, and they all do it, because there is a European foreign policy. I completely agree that the European defense, or European Union of Defense, European Defense Union, depends on a substantive European foreign policy. Without that, it's only an instrument, and so therefore there has to be a logic behind it. But I would say that although we don't have a classic foreign policy, we have large areas of agreement, and we have a situation where the areas of disagreement are highlighted for various reasons. There's sometimes very difficult issues. Relations with Russia, there are all sorts of different sensibilities. There are major problems, but we do have clearly a sense of Europeanness in the world, which is a very important basis from which to progress now and into the future. So I'm much more optimistic about that. And maybe I think that we will find that the UK will be accompanying European positions in many, many different parts of the world, despite having gone off on this glorious new global Britain thing.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado a todos. Obrigado a Mary Calder. Thank you very much, Mary Calder, for a very interesting presentation. You built an utopia anyway. And to João Cravinho, our Minister of Defense, very good and very interesting debate we had with both of them. And lembrem-se que no dia 9 de maio voltamos a ter aqui uma sessão, conto com a vossa participação e muito obrigado a todos por terem participado nesta última sessão das Utopias Europeias. E muito obrigado à Fundação Serralves por ter dado esta possibilidade, em particular à doutora Ana Pinho, muito obrigado. E muito boa noite.